All right. Hey, everybody. It is 2:01. I've got my three screens in front of me, so if you see me looking shoulder over shoulder, it's not a new dance move. I've just got my eyes in three directions, but I'm going to do my best to look at you all right here, straight ahead. My name is Daria Milburn. I am a product manager here at CREtelligent. I oversee the environmental product line, and my background is in environmental risk management, assessment, and remediation. Having worked sort of halves of my career in each area. I've been out in the field and done investigations and done remediation work, as well as worked on the other side at lending institutions and helping lenders manage environmental policies and programs and manage their risk in their portfolio from an environmental perspective. So been around the block for a while, and I was sort of born into this through watching my dad in this field. So I've been doing it my whole life, as I like to say. We're going to try to keep it interesting for you today. I got my colleague Gary Kulik on hand, and he's going to be recording this session. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat or the Q&A, and Gary will bring them up along the way. Gary, if you need to interrupt me, by all means do so. I'll be happy to answer any questions. It might be good to try to get through some of this information first, because sometimes I find that the next question is on the next slide, but by all means, keep track of things. And if there's something I'm not answering, let's make sure we get to it. From time to time, we get questions about our EPS report, what it is, how it works, what are some of the little quirks that folks see along the way. So I wanted to take a little time to explain some components about the report and answer some of the questions we received, really to help get people understanding a little bit more behind what goes into making the report. So all that being said, let's get right to it. Okay, here we go. Okay, so for those of you who have attended previous webinars with me, you'll recognize this slide. It gets a whole lot of mileage, but it's pretty handy for putting the levels of environmental screening into context relative to one another. It ranges from the least information to the most information, but today's focus itself is actually going to be on the database report. So to put it into CREtelligent vernacular, this is the same slide, but with the CREtelligent products that correlate on top. The one that you see that doesn't have a corresponding CREtelligent product is the questionnaire. And that's because that's something that's usually completed by an owner or an operator. So it isn't something that CREtelligent necessarily fills out, although we could cover it through a document review if you're having difficulty understanding what the responses mean, or if you're concerned about what a response means. But for today, we're really looking at our EnviroPreScreen. And that is sort of our flagship product, and it's the one that most of you are using. The pre-screen itself, the EPS, is really ideal use case, is really for screening or a quick check or monitoring, and I think that's how a lot of you do use it, to get that quick pulse of what's going on a property. But it is not intended to substitute for an EP opinion or replace a higher level report, especially because it does not include a historical review for concerns that might predate regulatory programs. That's a lot of words. What the heck did that mean? What that means is that comprehensive environmental regulations didn't come into play really until the late 1970s. And even when they did, those programs weren't really very well established till the late 80s or early 90s. So when you run an EPS report, you're not looking at historical property uses. So if there was a dry cleaner that operated from 1920 to 1945, that won't come up in an EPS. So that might be something that goes unidentified. So that goes into my next piece of advice, is to remember that no listings doesn't mean no problems. It just means nothing's been reported. So what does go into the database information? Well, these are environmental records maintained at the local, so it could be the municipality, the county, state, or federal agency levels. And they could pertain to anything from permits to programs, to violations, to spills, or other environmental conditions that are known on a property that are being addressed through one of these agencies. They track addresses, responsible entities, dates, statuses, and just other details that might be available about a listing. I'll use the state of Connecticut because I'm from Connecticut originally, although I'm in North Carolina now. The state of Connecticut provides copious notes. And so if you have listings in the state of Connecticut, you can generally look into the back of the report if you're using one of our EPS advanced reports, and you would see copious notes from the regulatory agencies. Whereas some states like Montana or Maine or Alabama are fairly rural and don't always include a lot of extra detail. So it really varies across the board. There's no agency to oversee all of the environmental agencies to say, you all have to do this the same way. That being said, all that information is entered in and into raw data files, and they're updated on varying cadences. So depending on the agency themselves, they might update that information publicly on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, semi-annual, or annual. So while in their offices, they're entering this information real time, the file that they make available publicly for download in a bulk data file is not updated in real time. It is updated in one of these cadences. So like we said, it's ideal uses for a quick check for big site information that one of these agencies might have on file, or for monitoring any new records that have occurred since your original review of a property. Some key considerations are that it only reflects what's been reported to an agency. So if something hasn't been reported, it's not going to show up in a database report. The data is controlled by the regulatory agency. So what is entered is the complete control of the agency entering it. So inconsistencies in data entry can result in misplotting or inaccurate data. A lat long, it doesn't take much for lat long to be off. Those are very precise numbers, but well, it may seem like it's not a big deal to be off by 0.01. That's enough to throw a point off in a map completely. So it could be a miskey of information, or it could be that the wrong entity was entered, or that a mailing address for a responsible party was used as the site address, or vice versa. So there's a lot of things that can go into poor public records. There's no standards for how this information is entered. There is no consistency agency across agency. And so that is one of the things to bear in mind as you're looking at these reports. So some common examples of environmental agencies that many of you who are on this call will be familiar with, and this is not exhaustive because there is not enough space on this slide to show every agency. But we've got the EPA, which is the mother lode. It's the big one. And then we've got state agencies. A lot of the state agencies will also push down responsibilities to the county level. So we know that in states like Florida and California, the counties are responsible for a lot of record keeping of environmental issues. In the state of New York City has their own environmental enforcement databases. So even at the city level, you can see that there are some agencies that oversee this. So it's important to understand that all these different agencies, there are hundreds, are all maintaining records of different sources, different natures, and that's where this information is coming from. So if we talk a little bit about the environmental data cycle, it starts with either operating permits, or let's say a release of chemicals, or an incident of some nature that occurs. And those get reported to the regulatory agencies. Those agencies then enter it into their electronic record, which then becomes that bulk data file. Oop, I went too fast. The bulk data file is then downloaded by data providers. And when you send a request to us about a specific site, we reach out to our data provider to get the raw data file relative to that site. And that's what's provided to CREtelligent, and we decipher that and organize it into our EPS report. So what the heck do I mean by that? Well, the general recipe for our EPS report includes 3 elements of mapping, data, and scoring. So what we're trying to do for you is provide a parcel-based experience because if you look in the case of this particular map, this is a very large area. And because we're searching out to 1/8 of a mile from the subject property, this is a multi-parcel area. And if we plotted in the middle and just used a point, 1/8 of the mile could very easily be contained within this area. So what we want to do is provide 1/8 of a mile out from the subject property boundary to give you the best data that we can and assess that risk relative to the subject. So we cross-reference this information with GIS partners who leverage the public record and county assessor data. So there's multiple ways to select your parcel using our system. You can do it via APN, you can enter an address, or you can manually draw it. Whichever way you choose to do it, we try to provide you that parcel or that area so that we can then measure out from that boundary. So it's important to remember that even at this level, there are imperfections in that data. I'll refer to an example in Florida, in a coastal area in Florida. We were trying to locate a site, and we were having some feedback from the client that it looked like it might have been off. When we went to the county assessor, it was off even more, and the county assessor's grid was skewed and wasn't even sitting over their property. And so we had to explain that, we're working within these boundaries, but when we have differences like that, even with the assessor's data being what it is, we're doing our best to try to plot these things appropriately. But ultimately, the public record is the public record. And so where these agencies have this information is the source, and that's where we might see some differences in plotting. So we get our raw data from our partner, and we translate that into a readable format. And this is just an example of, a report you guys would be familiar with. You generally see the listings come in that table. And if you go into advanced details, you might see us organize it in a more readable format. Otherwise, there would just be a whole lot of words and code, and it would be difficult for you all to translate. From that point, we then go into our scoring, where we evaluate the level of severity of different categories for listings. And then we cross-reference that with some of the mapping information. So to explain our scores a little bit, it means that something of note has occurred on a property. And if you have a low score, it means that the listing itself is likely less severe in nature based on the category or the distance from the subject property. A listing that's moderate, and I know that's yellow and horrible to read, my apologies to you on that, but the listing is worthy of additional scrutiny, maybe indicates that a feature has a higher potential risk to the property. A good example of that might be a hazardous waste generator permit or a stormwater discharge permit. It's important to be aware of it. You might want to look into it and find out a little bit more about it. But ultimately, relative to other categories of listings, isn't the highest concern. Where we come into the higher concerns is elevated, which means that something of significance has occurred at a property that indicates an impact may exist or has existed, or there is a condition that may be a significant threat to the subject property that really should be further researched to get a full understanding of how or if it was resolved. So these scores are not meant to mean that a property is low risk or it's the highest risk. It's meant to give you a relative rating of the significance or the severity of the type of listing, so that you can understand then what might be a bigger concern for your property. So that being said, let's get into some common things that we've heard. I'm sure as I go through these, you'll say, yeah, that's happened to me. So I'm going to ask, has this ever happened to you? You got this message from Radius: we're having trouble locating your property with the information provided. This is one that can come up, especially in rural areas. It's possible for many reasons. First, you want to be sure that did you search by APN? Did you search by address? Did you draw, or do you have a map or a survey that will allow you to draw the location in manually. There's a lot of things that could contribute to this. I talked a little bit about how the county assessor's ArcGIS grid may be off. Some counties have better record keeping than others, so rural areas generally have more difficult properties to locate. What you don't want to do is just rely on doing an internet search for your address, hoping that you hit it, because what can happen is that, and a lot of times, especially where there are poor property records, you'll see that the mapping systems will extrapolate on a line where your property might be located, and it might just pick the middle of the road, linear middle of the road, because it doesn't know where the exact address is. Or it could be that your address is a unit in a building, and that the building itself has one street address, but the units have mailing addresses that could be different. We've seen this happen and had to go down to Street View to find properties before. So there are a lot of reasons why you might see this happen. What you want to make sure is that when you're coming into mapping your property, you have as much information about where your property is located as possible so that you can map it in radius. We work with our partners to help you provide a more precise mapping experience. But like we've covered, there are a lot of reasons why the public record can vary or why it may not match up with what's in the record. Or maybe you've had something like this happen, where you've had different risk ratings on the same property within a short period of time. And I'm going to use an example of a recent report of one that was run just a few months after the previous, I think maybe within 3 months. So the property on the left came back initially with no listings. The property on the right had listings. But if you look, the listing actually was previously identified in a nearby property. So that would make you question, well, what the heck is going on? If you look a little more closely and look at the address originally was listed as 140 Main Street, but the new address is 140 Southwest 250th Street, which then squarely put that listing in the parcel of the subject property, which was a building that had contiguous units, and the subject was 120. The listing is at 140, but they were all within the same parcel. So it's important to look at these. What this means is that that public record was updated. That record with the agency updated that address. And that's why, while previously something had shown offsite, it then was able to be more accurately mapped on site because that public record was updated. Or maybe you've had this. You've mapped using an APN or parcel select or street address, but the listings in the report are not mapped the way you expect them to be mapped. So maybe your subject is listed in the database listings and it's listed as offsite, so it's not mapped in the correct location. Or maybe there's a nearby property that's been listed as on-site. Again, if there's been a discrepancy in the lat long, or there's been poor information provided about the location of the property, it's very easy, especially in urban areas, where there's smaller properties or tighter boundaries, for these properties to be plotted near each other, but not necessarily where you know them to be. It's important to know that across the agencies, there's little to no consistency for how data is entered. So this also includes mapping. There are standards. There are oftentimes with these listings, you'll also find that there's a responsible party, and there's a place for that to be entered in just about any of the agency's records. But sometimes that's confused with the area or the site that the property where the actual incident occurred. So sometimes these things could happen because the wrong information was put in the wrong place by the person who entered that information. But there's no common GIS system or portal for all these hundreds of agencies to be working together on plotting. And they also don't correlate with county assessors. So while it would be ideal if they did, it's unfortunate that they don't, and that also can lead to some of these discrepancies that you can find. So, and I think if I've said it once, I've probably said it about 5 times now, that the public record is definitely imperfect and rife with errors, especially when you have no consistency between agencies. So while the majority of listings are satisfactory, there still are many that are not. And it's important to remember that the data is owned and maintained by the regulatory agencies. So CREtelligent doesn't own the data. Sometimes we get requests where, well, can you please move this to another place? And that would really just be a cosmetic fix. It doesn't change the source. And we wouldn't be able to change the public record without some extensive work being done to contact the regulatory agency. And that really best comes from the property owner. Likely isn't going to happen before any pending transaction that you'd be working with. So it's important to remember this along the way so we can find ways to help you address that, which we'll get to shortly. So public record is subject to errors. It's subject to change. Erroneous data would have to be fixed at the source. And it doesn't always reflect the location of the concern. So sometimes, like we said before, the address of record is the administrative offices of the responsible party, not the impact location. We see this a lot with Superfund sites, that the actual area of impact for a Superfund site is actually a polygon, whereas there may be an address associated with it that's nowhere near that polygon. Sometimes the area of impact is large and includes your subject, even though your subject is not the source. So that, again, an example of that could be a Superfund site, it could be a brownfield area, but it's important to remember and look at these listings as they come up, because that moderate flag or that elevated flag is going to be the thing that tells you need to look at this a little bit more deeply to understand the nature of why this is coming up as moderate or elevated. And again, too, that rural areas are notorious for poor quality records. So if you tend to do a lot of business in areas that are fairly rural, or maybe have, me being from New England, I know there's a lot of small towns and their municipality offices maybe are not open at regular hours, or they're open, but they are very limited in the amount of information they have. It's just important to bear that in mind, and do the best you can to work with your customers to try to get the best information about where a property is located as possible. We certainly have a great team of CSMs who bend over backwards to try to help with that, and we're here to try to help with that as well, if you're really stumped. But the best way to get the best information and the most accurate information is to come with good information about your property to begin with. So,
and Daria, if you want to just take a quick breather there. I don't know if you have a glass of water. You've been going at it here. I had one quick question that came in related to the public record. Where does the public record change? Who can affect that change? Or who affects that change? Is it CREtelligent, the data aggregators, the owner of the property, the bank, the town clerk? How does that public record ultimately get changed if somebody finds that it's inaccurate?
Yeah, we're using this overarching term, public record, but really, like, every agency contributes to that. So it really depends on the agency that was responsible for the listing. They're the ones that own that information. They're the ones responsible for the quality of that information. So really the best way for that to be done is for somebody associated with the property, likely, an owner, would really be best. They'd have the best influence with an agency to go to them and explain to them why there is information that seems to be inaccurate in their listing, and provide supporting documentation for why that needs to be changed. Agencies, they don't just change information without really some cause. So they need to have justification for why that truly is. It could be that, your client has had a phase one done, and the phase one done previously was able to clarify that, that might be enough for an agency to look at and go, oh yeah, okay, that's good information. Thanks for sharing that with us. We can move that. But regardless, that's something that would have to be instigated by a person associated with the property. CREtelligent can help with that, but what we would do then is we would have to charge for our time and our materials. And to be honest, by that point, you're probably better off ordering one of our reports that can give you a conclusion and give you some additional value beyond just going to a regulatory agency, because it could take months before that's completed, and that's not something that we generally do. But it is something that a property owner or somebody associated with the property is well within their rights to do, and probably would have a stronger case in going to an agency to dispute a listing.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. So what can be done? So if you have documentation supporting why you believe this listing may be in error, like I said, to change the public record could take a long time. Agencies are slow to respond, and just in properties that they're overseeing remediation on, they may take, weeks or months to respond to. So to change some information that is a non-urgent issue in their mind, they may not prioritize that the highest. But there are things that can be done at your level, at your office level. So if you have supporting documentation, you can document it with a memo to your file and cite the detail that's in question, your rationale for why it is or is not an issue, and some supporting documentation that corroborates your finding. And if you're a lender, remember that the OCC, FDIC, and NCUA all have very clear expectations around review and analysis of the information or the environmental data that you're obtaining to review your properties. So if you had a memo in your file that shows, hey, yeah, we do scrutinize our information. We don't just get these reports and throw them in a file. We look at them, and when we find something that we have supporting documentation to have a different conclusion on, we document it. There is nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, I will say that that's probably something that would be looked favorably on by a regulator and an auditor. I once, when I was consulting, had a client whose lending operations were being threatened to be shut down by the FDIC because they were obtaining database reports, but just throwing them in a file, not looking at them, just put them in a file. We ran it, we did something, but they never looked at it, and they never had evidence that they looked at it. And so the FDIC was like, well, we have nothing proving that you're looking at this information. So either you do something about that and change your ways, or you just don't do any commercial lending, which then sparked a fire to build a very comprehensive environmental program. And they actually rocked it really well. They did a great job. But they started documenting everything that they were looking at, showing that they had touched it and that they had qualified review staff, because that's the next piece, is that these agencies, the FDIC, the OCC, NCUA, do expect that there are qualified individuals looking at these reports. So if you find that you're struggling to understand what you're looking at, or you don't have the time, or you need a little bit more than just your own voice, then you can also escalate to a different CREtelligent product to obtain a formal write-up by one of our qualified environmental professionals. What that will do is then it could take any of the discrepancies that you found. If you give us your supporting documentation, we can scrutinize that for you. And then what you end up getting is a fully insured professional opinion. So instead of the full responsibility of a decision being your company's responsibility, you can rely on an environmental professional and then start pointing to the EP opinion. And what that does is we carry insurance. You all require it when you engage with us, and that's why we have it. We're confident in the quality of our work. So if we go back to those risk identification tools, if we look at what would be next, that would be a lower cost tool that could help you accomplish what you're trying to achieve in deciphering some of those discrepancies you see, or understanding what's in the report more. The first level up from your EPS would be your EPS Pro Insight. And the next step up from that would be the RSRA. And that's where we would get our staff involved. You would get a formal written opinion along with that product. So that way you could then point to that opinion and use that as the basis for your decision. And that kind of just brings it all back to full circle. It's really about documenting what you have. If you've received something in a report that you really think isn't jiving, it's not adding up to what you know. I know that that many of you are very helpful in coming to us and letting us know that. And what we want to do is be able to help empower you to understand that, it just because it's come up in the EPS, if there is additional follow-up to document why that finding may be different from what you know, then you can put that in your file and we can help you with that. But whether you choose to do it yourself or come through us, what you really want to do is go back to just making sure that you have all your supporting documentation to document the difference. And that really is the bottom line. I know that this is a quick webinar. We honestly could probably spend 4 hours talking about this. So I've had to rein myself back. If you have additional questions, I'm happy to take them now. I didn't want to take too much time. I wanted to make this quick and easy for you all. So it's 2:32. Gary, I'm going to hand it over to you and see if anything's come in.
Daria, again, we had the earlier question on, changing the data source and how to go about doing that. There was one around, do you ever see like a drive to move to kind of a common data set amongst the various agencies, national, state, county? Will there ever be an effort in the future to just kind of standardize some things to simplify?
I mean,
and where would that effort come from?
If I got a 4-leaf clover, I would put that in as my wish, because it really would make things much easier. Although let's be honest, there are probably, and I'm not even going to say millions, I'm sure there's billions of records across the states for things that have happened. And to unify all of those is a very hefty task. Although now that we see a lot more going on with AI and the Internet of Things and understanding, the agencies understanding the value of consistency in data, I think that it's something that they might aspire to. It might happen slowly and start more at a local level, local to state, state to county, local to county, county to state. And then maybe states unify along the way, but
Agreed.
There's a whole lot. I mean, every state program is built differently. We all have encountered, different terms for closure, and this is one of the things that becomes really tricky, is understanding what is closure. Closure can be listed as closure in one state, but no further action in another state, or no further remedial action planned in another state, or response action outcome in another state, and nobody has a consistent way of saying that because all the programs are so different, and there's different classes of closure even in some of these. So there's different tiers. Some mean that a site's been fully remediated, whereas some mean that there's been a risk-based closure. So as much as I'd love to believe we're going to have consistency someday, I can promise you it won't be in my lifetime.
Right. Yeah, not a simple solution. We did have a couple come in here. I don't know if you see them in the Q&A as well. I think the first one came in. Explain the HVD on some reports, if you would.
Okay. Oh, yes. Thank you. Hey, Derek. So HVD is a highly variable database. So sometimes you'll see a report come up and there'll be some orange font that says something's been identified on a highly variable database, and it may or may not be an issue. Look into it further. There are some catch-all databases out there, and it's very difficult to discern because what exactly is going on, because they could have listings that are unimportant. It could be that there's some program where they got a grant, or it could be that they had an air discharge, or it could be that there has this waste generator, and it can run the gamut. And so there are some catch-all databases that might be a replica of another listing, or it might just catch something that fell through the cracks that doesn't have an absolutely defined program. It's hard to know, and so that's why it's listed as highly variable, because you can have a listing in there that could be very benign, or you can have a listing in there that may not be. And because it's a catch-all for orphans or for other databases, it's hard to tell without doing additional research into it.
Great, thanks, Daria. There's another one here in the queue. I have an elevated risk on a database search. What are the best next steps? Base it on a loan amount to tier the risk.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think usually the best next step would be to understand the history of the property. A lot of times when there is an elevated item, it usually indicates that you probably should move up to, at the minimum, a transaction screen or a phase one. Although that's not always the case. So if you're curious, we try to be pretty straight with our clients. If we think that you can do something pretty quickly with an RSRA, or even just have a pro insight to have one of our EPs look at it and go, yeah, you know what, this actually isn't that much of a concern. We'll tell you what we think would be the best product to match that. But it is good to at least have an EP look at it and let you know what the next step should be. Without knowing the exact listing, I couldn't tell you, but my gut usually is to go to something higher level that will involve a review of regulatory files and a site visit.
Great. We have another one that popped up here as well. If the EPS was stepped up to the pro opinion, generally, how would the ACM abatement and lead-based paint inspection and or abatement listing be treated?
Yeah, hi. This question is coming from an individual that sees a lot of that in a state that is an old state that has a lot of these listings come up in an urban area. If an EP were to look at the ACM and lead-based paint, I mean, obviously if it's associated with an abatement, and we've tried to scale back how those are rated. So if there's offsite ACM or lead-based paint abatement, we generally have tried to make those listings come back low because they're not affecting the subject property. But all that being said, there's always going to be that fringe case on the subject property where something may be an issue. So, I mean, in general, if it's been an abatement and there's abatement documentation available, or it's listed as abated through the agencies, generally our EPs don't recommend a phase one just for that purpose. But we also do have operations and maintenance plans available. So if you're concerned about lead paint or ACM and there's something further that you think needs to be done at a property to address that, we also have O&M plans that could help identify the materials of concern and identify practices that should be in place to make sure that they're not disturbed, or if they are disturbed, what would have to happen from that point. But just generally in a pro insight, we try not to make recommendations that we truly don't feel are necessary. So if we see lead-based paint or asbestos come up, our staff is pretty knowledgeable, and if it's not a concern, then they'll be sure to state that.
And I think that's it for the questions, Daria. I'll just turn it back to you to close things out.
Yeah, so I would say, I know that a bunch of our CSMs are on the call today, but they also have a straight line to me. So if you reach out to your CSMs, if you're curious about something, by all means, let them know. They'll let me know. But also, if you do think that you have good documentation that is different from our EPS report is not the Bible. It is not the be all and end all of environmental reports. It's just, if we go back actually to the scale, it's one of the earliest one of the least. I'm trying to go back to the slide for you guys so you can compare. Bear with me. Did that change? Give me a second so we can redo this for you. Let me go back to the slide so you can see how it compares and what's actually involved in it. It's a very minimal level report. Just again, looking at things that have been reported. So as long as your expectation of that report is just that you're looking for a quick check, and recognizing that it's not going to be as comprehensive as a phase one would be, that it doesn't look into the property's history, then you're using it right. But if you're looking to replace a phase one, it's definitely not the report to do that. So if you have questions about what could be best, there are multiple options in between the EPS and the phase one that are more affordable. Our desktops, are just a couple $100 and are pretty useful. So we can always work within that in the desktop range, but it's definitely not the report that is the most comprehensive on the environmental scale of reports. So we have options that we can be here to help you with, or if you're struggling with how to document your file or how to phrase it, we also are happy to help you think about some ways that you can look into doing that. We can point you in the direction of where to go, but ultimately remember that when you're coming to us, you're getting our insurance backing our EP's opinions. And a lot of times just knowing that you have a third party that you can point to for that decision making and for that help helps to deflect some of the responsibility from your agency or your company making that decision yourself if you feel like you may not be qualified to do it. So we're here, we're willing to help. We've got a great team of folks, and if anything oddball comes up, we by all means like to know about it. As a product person, I love to hear feedback because all it does is help us make our product better. And so please don't be shy. That's it.
All right, great. Thanks everybody for joining us, and be looking for more of these master classes in the future. Thanks, Daria, and thanks everybody for attending. Have a good day.